Look at the skyline of New York City. Look at the bridge that spans San Francisco. Look at the ships that won the Second World War. They all share the same DNA. They were forged in the fire of one single company, Bethlehem Steel. For a century, this was not just a factory. It was the backbone of the American superpower. It employed 300,000 people. It built the modern world. But today, the fires are cold. The headquarters is gone, and the backbone has snapped. How does a company that literally built America collapse into nothing? Was it killed by foreign enemies, or did it rot from the inside out? To understand the death of a giant, one must first understand the violence of its birth. In the early years of the 20th century, the Lehigh Valley of Pennsylvania was not yet the industrial engine of the Western world. It was a region defined by the quiet confluence of geography and resource. The Lehigh River cut through the landscape, a steady vein of water feeding into the Delaware, flanked by ridges of hard rock and valleys that would soon be choked with smoke. The air was still relatively clear, smelling of wet earth and river mud rather than sulfur and burning coal. But the geological destiny of this place had been written millions of years prior. To the north lay the anthracite coal fields, the fuel. Nearby were the iron mines, the raw material. And cutting through it all were the rail lines, the arteries that would pump the lifeblood of a new empire to the cities of the East Coast. It was here, in this quiet corner of the Commonwealth, that a dormant ironworks waited for a spark. The Salcona Iron Company had existed in name, a modest operation with modest ambitions, until it collided with the trajectory of a man who found modesty intolerable. Charles M. Schwab did not arrive in Bethlehem to manage a factory. He arrived to wage a war against the very industry he had helped create. He had been the president of U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in American history, a monolith of stability and conservative growth. But stability bored him. The boardroom of U.S. Steel, with its cautious bankers and risk-averse directors, felt like a cage. Schwab was a creature of the Gilded Age, a man who carried a $100,000 bill in his pocket not to spend, but to remind himself of the stakes he preferred to play for. He understood that in the production of steel, caution was the precursor to obsolescence. In 1904, he left the safety of the world's largest corporation to take control of the struggling Bethlehem Steel. It was a step down that confused his contemporaries on Wall Street. They saw a remote ironworks in a provincial town. Schwab saw a weapon. He envisioned a facility that would not merely compete with the Pittsburgh mills, but would render them outdated. The transformation of the landscape was immediate and violent. The quiet Moravian settlement of Bethlehem saw its skyline erased by the rise of smokestacks and the skeletal frames of blast furnaces. This was not gradual growth. It was an eruption. Schwab poured his personal fortune into the expansion, leveraging his reputation to borrow millions when the company had no credit. He was betting on a future that did not yet exist. At the center of this gamble was a single technological innovation, the gray mill. The conventional wisdom of the era held that structural steel beams, the kind required to hold up buildings, had to be riveted together from smaller plates. It was a slow, expensive, and labor-intensive process. Schwab believed in a new method, a universal rolling mill patented by an Englishman named Henry Gray, which could roll a single, solid H-shaped beam of massive structural integrity. The old guard at U.S. Steel had rejected the idea as technically impossible and financially reckless. Schwab staked the entire survival of his new company on it. The construction of the Gray Mill in Bethlehem was a spectacle of industrial hubris. It required machinery of a scale never before seen in the valley. When the first H-beam emerged from the rollers, it signaled the end of the age of masonry and the beginning of the age of the skyscraper. The skyline of Manhattan would not be built by brick and mortar. It would be hung on the steel skeletons rolled in Bethlehem. The gamble paid off, not in steady dividends, but in a monopoly on the vertical growth of American cities. But technology was only half of the equation. The other half was human. To run a machine of this magnitude, Schwab needed a workforce that operated with the same relentless intensity as the furnaces. He could not rely on the standard wage systems of the time, which paid men for their time regardless of their output. Schwab viewed a flat salary as a sedative. He wanted a stimulant. He introduced a compensation structure that would come to be known as the bonus system. It was a mechanism of psychological engineering as much as financial reward. Under this system, every task in the mill, from the shoveling of coal to the tapping of molten iron, was calculated and timed. A standard was set for the amount of work a man should be able to do in a day. If he met that standard, he received his base pay. If he exceeded it, the reward scaled aggressively. The impact on the factory floor was electric and brutal. The mill stopped being a place where men came to sell their hours. It became an arena where they sold their exhaustion. A crew moving ingots did not pace themselves for a 12-hour shift. They attacked the pile, driven by the calculation that an extra ton of steel moved was an extra dollar in the pay envelope. The chaotic, dangerous nature of steelmaking was disciplined by the precise logic of the ledger. This system created a strange, mercenary loyalty among the workers. They were not working for the glory of the company or the pride of the craft. They were working for the bonus. It aligned the interests of the lowest laborer with the highest executive. When the mill ran fast, everyone prospered. When the mill slowed, everyone suffered. It stripped away the paternalism of the 19th century factory owner and replaced it with a cold, transactional clarity. Schwab himself was the physical embodiment of this culture. He was not a distant financier operating from a Manhattan office. He was a presence in the heat of the plant. He understood the chemistry of the blast furnace and the physics of the rolling mill. He could speak the language of the foreman and the banker with equal fluency. This duality allowed him to drive the company with a singular autocratic vision. He did not need a board of directors to tell him if a new open-hearth furnace was necessary. He knew it was necessary because he understood the capacity of the old ones. The success of Bethlehem Steel in these early years was absolute. The company grew from a minor player into the second-largest steel producer in the United States, and in terms of technological capability, the first. The sheer volume of armor plate, gun forgings, and structural beams flowing out of the Lehigh Valley reshaped the global market. The town of Bethlehem swelled with immigrants drawn by the promise of the bonus, a babel of languages united by the rhythm of the shift whistle. Yet, within this spectacular rise, the architecture of the eventual fall was already being drafted. The system Schwab built was entirely dependent on the philosophy of constant expansion and high-risk capital investment. It functioned because there was a singular genius at the helm who could navigate the precipice between bankruptcy and boom. The organization was not built to manage a steady state. It was built to conquer. The bonus system relied on the premise that there would always be more demand, more orders, and more growth to fund the incentives. It assumed that the hunger of the world for steel would never abate. Furthermore, the culture of the company was molded in the image of its founder, aggressive, confident, and dismissive of outside counsel. Schwab's disdain for the cautious accountants and bureaucratic managers of his former life at U.S. Steel meant that he surrounded himself with men who mirrored his own impulses. They were Schwab's boys, executives who prioritized production volume above all else. They learned to solve problems by building bigger machines and running them faster. They did not learn the subtle arts of cost containment, diversification, or labor relations. They learned that the answer to every question was more steel. As the fires of the blast furnaces turned the night sky over the Lehigh Valley a permanent, throbbing orange, the company seemed invincible. The founding era of Bethlehem Steel was a testament to the power of individual will imposed upon material reality. Schwab had taken a failing ironworks and a quiet river valley and hammered them into a colossus. He had proved that high risk yielded high reward, but institutions built around the personality of a great man often struggle to survive his mortality. The DNA of Bethlehem Steel was coded for the specific environment of the early 20th century, a time of unbridled industrial growth and successful gambling. The systems put in place, the bonus, the reliance on massive capital projects, the autocratic leadership were perfectly calibrated for the rise. Whether they could sustain a plateau or weather a decline was a question that the roaring mills were too loud to ask. The genius had built a machine that required a genius to drive it. Geography is often mistaken for background, but in the history of heavy industry, geography is destiny. The rise of Bethlehem Steel was not merely a product of financial gambling or executive will. It was the result of a specific geological alignment that made the Lehigh Valley of Pennsylvania one of the few places on Earth where such a colossus could exist. The logic of the location was written in the stone long before the first foundation was poured. Steel production is a massive act of consumption. It requires three primary ingredients to be brought together in violent quantities: iron ore to provide the metal, limestone to flux out the impurities, and coal, specifically coke, to fuel the blast furnaces and strip the oxygen from the ore. If these materials are too distant from one another, the cost of transport destroys the profit margin before the furnace is even lit. Bethlehem sat at the precise center of this geological triad. To the north lay the anthracite coal regions, the densest concentration of high-carbon fuel in the Americas. To the immediate vicinity lay the limestone quarries and the magnetite iron mines of the Redding Prongs. And cutting through the center of it all was the Lehigh River. The river was not just a water source, it was the mechanism of transport. Before the railroad, the canal system had carved a path through the mountains. But it was the arrival of the Lehigh Valley Railroad that turned the valley into a funnel. The tracks ran parallel to the water, creating a seamless artery connecting the raw materials of the interior to the deep water ports of New York and Philadelphia. The factory did not need to search for a supply chain. The supply chain was the landscape itself. This convergence transformed the topography. The plant was not built in the town, it consumed the riverbank. The complex stretched for 4.5 miles along the southern edge of the Lehigh River, a dense, blackened scar of iron and concrete that effectively became a separate sovereign state. The geography of the city was cleaved in two. To the north of the river lay the old established community. To the south lay the mill and the sprawling, chaotic housing of the workforce. The physical divide was absolute, bridged only by the structures that fed workers into the plant and brought steel out. The transformation of the town of Bethlehem from a quiet religious outpost to an industrial titan is one of the most jarring cultural shifts in American history. The settlement had been founded in 1741 by Moravians, a Germanic Protestant sect seeking isolation and spiritual purity. They had named the town Bethlehem on Christmas Eve, intending it to be a city of peace. They were pacifists, communal in nature, and deeply suspicious of the outside world. For over a century, the air in the valley was defined by the ringing of church bells and the quiet industry of craftsmen. The arrival of the steel mill obliterated this silence. The pacifist settlement became the primary forge for the weaponry of the 20th century. The communal gardens were overshadowed by the smoke of the blast furnaces, which deposited a fine layer of graphite and graphite dust onto every windowsill and storefront in the borough. The irony of the location was inescapable. The Christmas City, founded to celebrate the Prince of Peace, became the Arsenal of America, producing the armor plate and heavy guns that would define global warfare. This friction between the old world and the new was visible in the architecture. The Moravian structures were built of limestone and timber, designed to last for centuries of quiet use. The steel plant was built of riveted metal and brick, designed to be consumed and rebuilt in the pursuit of efficiency. The plant did not respect the scale of the human. The blast furnaces rose hundreds of feet into the air, dwarfing the church steeples that had once dominated the skyline. At night, the dump of molten slag down the riverbank lit up the valley with an apocalyptic orange glow, a man-made volcano that signaled the factory never slept. The railroad was the circulatory system that kept this organism alive. By the mid-20th century, the logistical operation required to feed the Bethlehem plant was a feat of engineering that rivaled the steelmaking itself. Hundreds of rail cars arrived daily. They carried coal from West Virginia and Kentucky, ore from the Great Lakes, and eventually from South America, and limestone from local quarries. The layout of the plant was a study in linear flow. Raw materials entered at one end, moved through the coke ovens, into the blast furnaces, through the open hearths, and finally into the rolling mills, emerging at the far end as finished beams and plates. It was a machine of continental scale. The Lehigh Valley Railroad became one of the wealthiest lines in the world, simply by serving this single master. The tracks wove through the factory floor, a dense web of steel moving steel. The noise was constant, the shunting of cars, the hiss of air brakes, the roar of the tipping coal cars. It was the sound of a geographical advantage being exploited to its absolute limit. But the location offered more than just resources. It offered a labor pool that was uniquely suited to the brutality of the work. The Lehigh Valley was a magnet for the waves of European immigration that defined the era. The Irish, the Italians, the Hungarians, the Poles, the Slovaks, and the Windish, They poured into South Bethlehem, drawn by the promise of steady work. They settled in neighborhoods that were segregated by ethnicity, but united by the shadow of the stacks. The topography of South Bethlehem was steep, with houses built into the hillsides overlooking the plant. A worker could stand on his front porch and look down into the open maw of the mill where he would spend his shift. The company capitalized on this density. They did not need to build a transit system because the workforce lived within walking distance of the gates. The shift change was a tidal movement of humanity. Thousands of men would stream down the streets of South Bethlehem, crossing the bridges and entering the plant, while thousands more streamed out, their faces blackened with soot, their bodies exhausted. The city was not a separate entity from the factory. It was the dormitory for the machine. The success of Bethlehem Steel in this location created a sense of permanence that bordered on arrogance. The sheer physical mass of the plant suggested that it was as immutable as the mountains that surrounded it. The logic was circular and seemingly unbreakable. The coal was here, the river was here, the rail was here, and the people were here. Therefore, the steel would always be here. The executives in the headquarters viewed the geography as a fortress. In the early part of the century, the isolation of the Lehigh Valley protected them. They were close enough to New York to control the financial markets and close enough to Philadelphia to control the shipyards, yet far enough away to run their city as a fiefdom without interference. The local government, the police, and the newspapers were all essentially satellites of the corporation. The valley was a closed ecosystem, fed by the resources of the earth and the labor of the immigrants, all directed toward the singular purpose of smelting iron. As the decades passed, the smoke that trapped itself in the valley became a symbol of prosperity. To the residents, clean air meant unemployment. Graphite on the laundry hanging on the line was the tax paid for a steady pension. The environmental toll was viewed not as damage, but as a byproduct of existence. The river turned dark with runoff. The trees on the surrounding hills struggled to breathe, but the furnaces roared on. The location had delivered everything it promised. It had provided the fuel, the metal, the transport, and the men. It had allowed a single company to dominate the skyline of the world. Standing on the banks of the Lehigh River in the middle of the 20th century, looking at the miles of smokestacks and the endless train of rail cars, one could be forgiven for thinking that this convergence of geology and industry was eternal. The earth had given up its riches to this specific spot, and the men of Bethlehem had built a monument to harvest them. The resources appeared endless. The rails seemed to stretch to infinity. The river flowed constantly. It seemed that nothing could stop them, because the land itself was on their side. If geography provided the potential for power, war provided the catalyst. The conflict that engulfed the globe in the 1940s did not merely utilize the capacity of Bethlehem Steel, it demanded the impossible. When the United States entered World War II, the industrial logic of the nation shifted overnight from profit to survival. The ledger books were effectively closed, and the only metric that remained was tonnage. The transformation of the Bethlehem plant from a commercial entity into the arsenal of democracy was absolute. The sprawling complex along the Lehigh River ceased to be a private enterprise in any practical sense. It became a sovereign organ of the Allied war effort. The federal government did not just place orders, it relied on Bethlehem Steel to design the architecture of victory. The company possessed the unique ability to produce everything required for modern naval warfare: the raw steel, the armor plate, the heavy caliber guns, and finally, the ships themselves. In the span of 4 years, the output of this single corporation eclipsed the total industrial production of entire enemy nations. The statistics of this period are difficult to comprehend in a modern context. Bethlehem Steel employed 300,000 people during the peak of the war. They operated not just the home plant in Pennsylvania, but shipyards in Massachusetts, Maryland, California, and New Jersey. The mandate was simple: build a bridge of steel across the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The response was the construction of 1,127 ships. This included aircraft carriers, destroyers, and the massive battleships that would define the era. At the height of production, Bethlehem Steel was launching a new warship every single day. It was a feat of logistics that defied the known limits of manufacturing. But the heart of this effort remained in the blast furnaces of the Lehigh Valley. This was where the war was won, not with gunpowder, but with coke and iron ore. To understand the scale of this contribution, one must understand the environment of the blast furnace. It was a place where the atmosphere was hostile to human life. The furnace was a towering vertical reactor, lined with heat-resistant brick and encased in steel armor, rising over 100 feet into the air. It operated on a principle of violent reduction. Iron ore, coke, and limestone were fed into the top, while superheated air was blasted into the bottom. Inside the column, the temperature reached 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The coke burned, stripping the oxygen from the ore and melting the iron, while the limestone absorbed the impurities to form slag. The result was a liquid metal that flowed like water but burned like the surface of the sun. The men who worked the cast house floor at the base of the furnace lived in a perpetual twilight of smoke and fire. When the furnace was tapped, a clay plug at the base was drilled out, releasing a torrent of molten iron. The light generated by the flow was so intense it could blind an unprotected eye in seconds. The heat was a physical weight, pressing against the skin, drying out the lungs. The roar of the blast was constant, a deafening background radiation that vibrated in the chest cavities of the workers. Safety protocols in the 1940s were rudimentary compared to modern standards. The men wore wool to protect against sparks, heavy leather boots, and dark goggles. They communicated by hand signals, cutting through the din of the machinery. Danger was an omnipresent colleague. A slip on the casting floor, a splash of molten metal, or a slip inside the furnace caused by trapped gas could result in catastrophic injury or death. Yet, the furnaces never stopped. They ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. To shut down a blast furnace was a massive, costly operation that could take weeks to reverse. So they ran hot, consuming mountains of raw material and spitting out the iron that would become the hull of a destroyer or the casing of a bomb. The plant functioned like a biological organism, a dragon that never slept. It inhaled coal trains from the north and exhaled weaponry to the east. The night sky over Bethlehem was never dark. The glow of the quench towers and the open hearths painted the clouds in perpetual shades of orange and bruised purple. Residents of the city did not need clocks. They lived by the rhythm of the shift whistle and the sky. This intensity required a suspension of normal economic rules. During the war, the government issued cost-plus contracts. The priority was speed and volume, not efficiency or frugality. If Bethlehem Steel needed to hire 10,000 more men to meet a quota, they hired them. If they needed to burn more fuel to heat the furnaces faster, they burned it. The cost was irrelevant. This environment created a culture where production was God and accounting was an afterthought. The company learned that the answer to any problem was simply to throw more resources at it. It was a lesson that served them well in war, but it planted a seed of recklessness that would germinate in the decades to follow. The output was not just about bulk, it was about precision. Bethlehem was one of the few places in the world capable of forging the massive armor plates required for battleships. These were slabs of steel, inches thick, hardened to withstand ballistic impact. The company also forged the 16-inch guns for the Iowa-class battleships, weapons capable of hurling a Volkswagen-sized shell over 20 miles. The metallurgy required for this was exacting. A microscopic flaw in the steel of a gun barrel could cause it to explode when fired. The pressure on the workforce was not just to produce, but to be perfect. The war also reshaped the demographics of the factory floor. With thousands of young men drafted into the armed forces, the company turned to women to fill the void. They worked as welders, crane operators, and machinists, stepping into roles that had been exclusively male since the dawn of the Iron Age. It was a social revolution born of necessity, though in the culture of the mill, they were simply another necessary component of the machine. The focus remained on the system, not the individual. The system demanded labor, and it took it from wherever it could be found. By 1945, Bethlehem Steel stood at the apex of industrial power. The company had essentially armed the free world. Its ships had hunted submarines in the Atlantic and destroyed the Japanese Imperial Navy in the Pacific. Its steel held up the bridges that the troops crossed and the buildings where the peace treaties were signed. The sense of accomplishment within the company was profound and justified. They had done the impossible. They had outproduced the Axis powers through sheer force of will and thermal energy. When the guns finally fell silent in August of 1945, the blast furnaces of Bethlehem kept roaring. The war was over, but the momentum of the machine was too great to arrest. The company emerged from the conflict not just as a business, but as a national hero. They had proven that American industry was an unstoppable force. The executives, the managers, and the union leaders looked at the smoking expanse of the plant and saw a confirmation of their own invincibility. They believed they had mastered the alchemy of steel and the management of men. They had won the war. They had defeated the external enemy. But in the artificial economic environment of total war, they had forgotten how to compete in a world where cost mattered. The habits formed in the heat of the arsenal, the reliance on volume, the disregard for efficiency, the assumption that the government would always need more, were now baked into the culture of the corporation. They were invincible in war. But the hardest battle was coming, the battle for peace. The end of the war did not bring the silence that many in the Lehigh Valley anticipated. Instead, it brought a different kind of noise. As the demand for armor plate and artillery shells subsided, a new hunger emerged from the American continent. The soldiers returning from Europe and the Pacific did not want to return to the boarding houses and streetcars of their youth. They wanted homes in the suburbs. They wanted automobiles with chrome bumpers. They wanted refrigerators, washing machines, and televisions. The United States was embarking on the greatest consumer expansion in history, and every single element of this new lifestyle required steel. Bethlehem Steel sat at the roaring center of this post-war economy. The company transitioned seamlessly from the arsenal of democracy to the foundry of the American dream. The blast furnaces, which had melted iron for battleships, now melted it for station wagons and the structural girders of a rapidly verticalizing corporate America. The monopoly that the United States held on global manufacturing meant that for the next 2 decades, efficiency was less important than volume. If the mill could produce the metal, the world would buy it. This economic dominance created a unique sociological phenomenon in the towns surrounding the plant. For the first time in industrial history, the physical laborer was admitted into the middle class. The social contract of the 1950s was unwritten but absolute. In exchange for dangerous, exhausting, and physically degrading work, the company provided a life of material security that had previously been reserved for the white-collar professional. A job at the Steel, as locals called it, was not merely employment, it was a membership in a comprehensive welfare state. A young man could walk out of Liberty High School on a Friday, walk into the employment office on 4th Street on a Monday, and secure a future that guaranteed a mortgage, a pension, and the education of his unborn children. No college degree was required. The only requirement was the willingness to endure the heat and the shift work. The resulting prosperity transformed the landscape of Bethlehem. The harsh, overcrowded tenements of the immigrant generation gave way to neat rows of bungalows with manicured lawns. The driveways were filled with the very cars the workers helped build. It was common for a steel worker to own a home, 2 vehicles, a hunting cabin in the Pocono Mountains, and a boat for the weekends. This was the era of the blue-collar aristocrat. The disparity between the man on the factory floor and the local doctor or lawyer was, in economic terms, negligible. The company wove itself into the biological fabric of the community. The medical insurance was comprehensive, covering everything from the delivery of infants to the care of the elderly. The cradle-to-grave philosophy was not a slogan. It was an operational reality. The company sponsored baseball leagues, bowling teams, and musical bands. The intense loyalty this engendered was distinct from the fear-based motivation of the Schwab era. It was a loyalty born of gratitude and shared destiny. When a man put on his hard hat, he wasn't just working for a paycheck. He was working to maintain the ecosystem that supported his family. The rhythm of the city was dictated by the clock of the plant. The shift changes at 7 a.m., 3 p.m., and 11 p.m. were seismic events. Traffic patterns in the valley reversed instantly as thousands of cars streamed toward the majestic blackened gates of the plant, passing thousands of cars streaming out. The bars and diners along 3rd and 4th Streets operated on a 24-hour cycle, serving shots of whiskey and beers to men ending their day at 8 in the morning. The smell of the plant, a pungent mix of sulfur and coke gas, was not considered pollution. It was the smell of money. If the wind blew the smoke away from the town, shopkeepers would worry, because clean air meant the furnaces were down and wallets were shutting. However, this golden age masked a growing rigidity in the system. The prosperity was maintained by the formidable power of the United Steelworkers of America. The Union had grown from a struggling organization into a monolithic force capable of shutting down the national economy. In the boardrooms, the relationship with labor shifted from dominance to appeasement. The executives, looking at their overflowing order books, calculated that a strike was more expensive than a raise. It was easier to pass the cost of increased wages onto the customer than to silence the mills. This dynamic reached its climax in 1959. The steel strike of that year was a turning point that defined the future trajectory of the industry. For 116 days, the mills went cold. It was a test of endurance between the workforce and the management. The union demanded that the high standard of living be codified and protected against the encroachment of automation and work rule changes. They wanted to ensure that the social contract was ironclad. The strike ended in a victory for the workers, but it was a victory that came with a hidden cost. The settlement resulted in substantial wage increases and benefit protections, cementing the steelworkers' status at the top of the industrial food chain. But it also signaled to the world that American steel was becoming expensive. During the strike, for the first time, domestic customers faced a shortage. Desperate for material, they began to import steel from rebuilding nations like Japan and Germany. It was a small trickle, barely noticed in the flood of profits, but the door had been opened. Inside the plant, the atmosphere after 1959 was one of triumphant complacency. The workers had won, the company was profitable, the system seemed perfect. The dangerous, chaotic nature of the work remained. Men still lost fingers, inhaled silica dust, and dodged moving ingots. But the compensation made it acceptable. A father could look at his son and tell him that there was no need to leave the valley, no need to seek a different life. The mill would always be there. It was as permanent as the river. But as the 1960s approached, the leadership that presided over this empire began to change. The generation of men who had built the mills, the Schwab's boys, who knew the taste of coal dust, were retiring or dying off. They were being replaced by a new breed of executive. These were men drawn from the legal and financial departments. Men who viewed the making of steel not as a craft to be mastered, but as an asset to be managed. They moved into the executive offices, which were increasingly detached from the reality of the cast house floor. They inherited a machine that printed money, and their primary goal was to not disrupt the flow. They approved the wage hikes, they approved the benefit packages, and they approved the dividends. They were the caretakers of the American dream, presiding over a system that felt eternal. They played golf at the Silicon Valley Country Club, confident that the smoke rising in the distance was the exhaust of a perpetual motion machine. The workers, securing their boats to the trailers in their driveways, believed the same. They had held up their end of the bargain. They produced the steel that built the highways and the skyscrapers. They believed the company would always be able to pay the bill. They did not see that the high walls of their paradise, which protected them from the economic realities of the outside world, blocked their view of the storm gathering on the horizon. To the observer standing on the 3rd Street Bridge, the administration building of Bethlehem Steel appeared to be part of the same organism as the factory. It sat adjacent to the blast furnaces, a massive cruciform structure of dark stone and imposing vertical lines. The workers called it the Black House. In the geography of the Lehigh Valley, it was separated from the heat of the cast floor by only a few hundred yards of asphalt and rail track. But in the operational reality of the corporation, the distance between the executive suite and the mill was measured in light years. By the 1960s, the management culture of Bethlehem Steel had calcified into an aristocracy. The rough-edged, risk-taking ethos of Charles Schwab had been polished away, replaced by a rigid hierarchy that prioritized protocol over production. The men who occupied the upper floors of the Black House viewed themselves less as manufacturers of metal and more as statesmen of an industrial empire. They did not wear hard hats. They wore tailored suits. They did not smell of sulfur. They smelled of old paper and filtered air. The insulation of the executive class was not accidental. It was architectural. The elevators in the headquarters were segregated. There were cars for the general staff and private cars for the directors, operated by attendants who knew the names and the floors of the vice presidents by heart. The offices were silent, insulated from the earth-shaking rumble of the heavy forge just outside the window by thick masonry and heavy drapes. Here, the business of steel was conducted in hushed tones, far removed from the violent physics required to create it. This detachment bred a culture of profound excess. In an era when competitors abroad were rebuilding their shattered industries with lean, desperate efficiency, Bethlehem Steel operated with the pomp of a minor monarchy. The most visible symbol of this hubris was the corporate Air Force. The company maintained a fleet of private aircraft that rivaled the air forces of small nations. The hangar at the local airport was a transit hub for a fleet of Gulfstream jets and helicopters, ready to ferry executives to meetings in New York, lobbying trips to Washington, or frequently to vacation homes in the Carolinas and Florida. The justification was efficiency, the need to move decision-makers quickly across the company's sprawling assets. The reality was status. Access to the jets was a badge of rank, a signal that one had ascended above the concerns of cost. On the ground, the perks were equally lavish. The company employed a legion of chauffeurs. Executives were driven from their homes in the breathless leafy enclave of Saucon Valley to the front steps of the Black House. It was not uncommon for these drivers to be tasked with domestic errands, ferrying wives to shopping appointments or children to private schools, all on the company payroll. Security guards were dispatched to watch over private residences while families went on vacation. The line between corporate assets and personal convenience had dissolved. The true center of executive gravity, however, was not the boardroom, but the Saucon Valley Country Club. Owned and operated under the benevolent shadow of the corporation, it was a sanctuary of green fairways and stone clubhouses. Here, promotion and strategy were discussed over rounds of golf. A man's handicap was often as important to his career trajectory as his knowledge of metallurgy. The culture rewarded those who fit in, who played the game, and who did not rock the boat with uncomfortable questions about efficiency or modernization. Innovation was viewed with suspicion. It implied that the current way of doing things, the way that provided the jets and the club memberships, was insufficient. This atmosphere of entitlement did not go unnoticed by the workforce. The thousands of men walking through the gates below saw the limousines. They saw the helicopters taking off. They understood that the company was awash in money, and they decided that if the company was going to spend carelessly on the comfort of the few, the many were going to extract their price for peace. The United Steelworkers of America, observing the excesses of the Black House, adopted a strategy of aggressive extraction. The adversarial relationship that developed was not based on a mutual desire to save the company, but on a mutual desire to exploit it. The union leadership looked at the executive dining rooms and the corporate retreats and concluded that any talk of belt-tightening was a lie. If the bosses were feasting, the workers would not settle for crumbs. Negotiations ceased to be about the economic reality of the steel market and became a contest of leverage. The union demanded and received contracts that detached wages from productivity. They negotiated work rules of labyrinthine complexity. A welder could not move a hose. A pipe fitter had to be called. A machinist could not sweep his own station. A laborer had to be summoned. Every task was compartmentalized, requiring more men to do the same amount of work. The company agreed to these inefficiencies because, in their arrogance, they believed they could afford them. They believed the customer would always pay the surcharge for American steel. The result was a bloated cost structure that defied gravity. By the mid-1970s, the labor cost per ton of steel at Bethlehem was significantly higher than the national average and vastly higher than the international competition. But the check was always signed. To force a strike was to disrupt the golf game. To grant a raise was merely to adjust a ledger entry. The climax of this disconnect arrived not with a bang, but with a silent, creeping paralysis. It manifested in the 30-and-out rule and the escalating pension obligations. The union negotiated a provision allowing workers to retire with a full pension after 30 years of service, regardless of age. It was a victory for the laborer, who could leave the punishing heat of the mill in his late 40s. But for the company, it was a demographic time bomb. They were creating a system where the number of people collecting checks would eventually eclipse the number of people producing steel. They were effectively paying two workforces, one to run the machines and a larger one to stay home. Yet, inside the Black House, the alarm bells were muffled by the thick carpets. The focus remained on the maintenance of the hierarchy. Reports detailing the rising efficiency of Japanese imports were read, filed, and largely ignored. The assumption remained that Bethlehem Steel was the market, and the market could not function without it. The executives believed they were the captains of an unsinkable ship, too large to be swamped by the waves of global trade. The tragedy of this era was not simply greed, it was blindness. The management and the union were locked in a dance of mutual assured destruction, fighting over the distribution of profits that were already beginning to evaporate. They were arguing over who got the window seat on the plane, unaware that the engines were flaming out. The disconnect was absolute. In the mill, men were fighting for job classifications and overtime hours. In the club, men were fighting for vice presidencies and tea times. And in the space between them, the fundamental competence of the corporation, the ability to make steel at a competitive price, was being suffocated by the very wealth it had created. The collapse of an empire is rarely a sudden event. It is a process of slow erosion where the structural integrity of the institution is compromised long before the facade cracks. For Bethlehem Steel, the erosion began not with a lack of money, but with a surplus of certainty. The company had dominated the 20th century so completely that its leadership believed they had solved the riddle of steel production. They believed the methods that had built the Golden Gate Bridge and the U.S. Navy were not just effective, but eternal. This certainty blinded them to a technological revolution that was reshaping the rest of the world. In the ashes of post-war Europe and Japan, the steel industry had been forced to start from zero. Because their factories had been bombed into oblivion, German and Japanese engineers were free to adopt the newest, most radical technologies available. They did not have the burden of legacy infrastructure. They built their recovery on the basic oxygen furnace. The basic oxygen process was a leap forward in metallurgy. It replaced the slow, simmering cook of the traditional furnace with a violent, high-speed injection of pure oxygen. It could turn a batch of iron into high-grade steel in 45 minutes. In Pennsylvania, Bethlehem Steel was still using the open hearth method. This was the technology of the 19th century, reliable, familiar, and agonizingly slow. An open hearth furnace required 8 to 9 hours to produce the same amount of steel that the new oxygen furnaces produced in under an hour. The math was inescapable. A ton of Japanese steel cost significantly less to produce than a ton of American steel, simply because of the speed of the process. Yet, when presented with this data, the executives in the Black House remained unmoved. They viewed the basic oxygen furnace as an unproven gimmick, a rash experiment by desperate nations. They argued that the open hearth produced a higher quality product, a craftsman's steel that justified the extra time. It was a defense born of arrogance. The engineers of Bethlehem Steel convinced themselves that the laws of economics did not apply to them because they were Bethlehem Steel. They doubled down on the past. In a decision that would haunt the company for decades, management chose to invest hundreds of millions of dollars into upgrading the old open hearth furnaces rather than replacing them. It was the industrial equivalent of putting a new engine in a carriage while the rest of the world was buying jet aircraft. By the time they finally admitted their error and began to transition to basic oxygen in the late 1960s, the gap was too wide to close. The foreign competitors had already captured the market for efficiency. While the factories rusted into obsolescence, the company's appetite for grandeur remained undiminished. As profit margins thinned and the specter of layoffs began to loom over the valley, the leadership decided that the old headquarters, the Black House, was no longer sufficient for their status. They needed a symbol that reflected their self-perception as masters of the universe. In 1969, they broke ground on Martin Tower. It was to be the tallest building in the Lehigh Valley, a 21-story cruciform skyscraper of glass and steel that would dominate the skyline. The location chosen was significant. They did not build it next to the grit and noise of the plant. They built it miles away, in a quiet, leafy suburb, physically removing the leadership from the reality of the production line. The construction of Martin Tower was a masterclass in corporate cognitive dissonance. At the very moment the steel industry was entering its long, painful contraction, Bethlehem Steel was building a palace. The tower was designed with an opulent disregard for cost. It featured hand-woven carpets, original artwork, and executive suites with panoramic views of the mountains. The building was structured like a medieval court. The higher the floor, the higher the rank. To have an office near the top was the ultimate validation of a career. For the workers driving past the construction site on their way to the sweltering, dangerous conditions of the coke works, the tower was a confusing signal. It suggested unlimited wealth. It suggested that the rumors of competition and decline were false. How could a company be in trouble if it was building a skyscraper? But inside the plant, the signs of decay were becoming impossible to ignore. The lack of investment in basic maintenance began to manifest in small, grinding failures. Machinery broke down more frequently. The rail tracks that moved the ingots warped and were not replaced. The cradle-to-grave promise began to fray. A secondary narrative of decline was written in the households of the workers. The sons of the men who had enjoyed the golden age of the 1950s were now entering the workforce, expecting the same trajectory. They were hired, but the stability was gone. The pattern of hiring and firing became erratic. A young man might work for 6 months, get laid off for 3, then get called back. The rhythm of the valley was broken. The confidence that had allowed a steelworker to buy a boat and a cabin was replaced by a low-level anxiety. The climactic moment of this era of denial came in 1977. It was the year of the flood. Not a flood of water, but a flood of cheap, high-quality foreign steel that washed over the American market. The levees of tariff protection and customer loyalty finally broke. For the first time, major American construction projects and automotive companies began buying foreign steel in bulk. It wasn't just cheaper. In many cases, thanks to the new technology Bethlehem had rejected, it was better. The response from Martin Tower was paralysis. The executives, ensconced in their new glass fortress, looked down at the valley and could not comprehend why the old levers of power were not working. They had the tower, they had the history, they had the name, but they had forgotten that steel is a commodity, and a commodity market has no respect for tradition. The tower stood as a perfect shiny monolith rising out of the green suburbia. But a few miles away, the blast furnaces were beginning to look like ancient ruins. The paint was peeling, the metal was rusting, and the fires were burning inefficiently. The juxtaposition was stark. They had built a skyscraper to touch the clouds, while their foundation was crumbling into the mud. The end of the steelmaking era in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, did not come with the bang of an explosion or the crash of a market. It arrived with a silence so profound that it woke people from their sleep. For 135 years, the city had possessed a heartbeat. It was a low-frequency rumble, a subsonic vibration generated by the massive blowers that fed air into the blast furnaces. It was a sound that penetrated the walls of every home in South Bethlehem, a constant reassurance that the mill was alive. But on the morning of November 18th, 1995, the blowers were turned off. The vibration stopped, and for the first time in nearly a century and a half, the city was quiet. The decision to cease steel production at the home plant was the culmination of a long, agonizing retreat. By the mid-1990s, Bethlehem Steel was a shadow of the titan that had armed the Allies. The company had already closed vast sections of the complex. The coke ovens, which had once turned the sky orange, were cold. The heavy forge, which had shaped the guns of the Iowa class, was silent. But the core of the operation, the making of liquid iron from ore, had persisted. The last cast was a ceremony of mourning. It was not attended by the executives from Martin Tower. It was attended by the men who had spent their lives in the heat. As the final batch of molten iron flowed from the tap hole of Blast Furnace C, the workers gathered to watch. There were tears on the faces of men who had been hardened by decades of dangerous labor. They were not just watching a factory close, they were watching the erasure of their identity. When the flow of iron stopped, the workers did something that was not in any manual. They took their hard hats off. They shook hands. And then, one by one, they walked out of the cast house, leaving the furnace to cool. It would take weeks for the residual heat to dissipate, but the life of the machine was over. The dragon that had never slept was finally dead. The physical shutdown of the plant was a trauma for the community, but the legal death of the corporation was a betrayal. For 6 years after the last cast, Bethlehem Steel existed as a zombie corporation. It still had assets, other smaller plants, land, and the massive headquarters, but it was drowning in debt. The primary weight pulling it under was not the cost of making steel, but the cost of the past. The cradle-to-grave promises made in the golden era of the 1950s had come due. The company had roughly 12,000 active employees, but it was paying pensions and health care for over 130,000 retirees and their dependents. It was a demographic impossibility. In 2001, the inevitable finally happened. Bethlehem Steel filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. To the financial analysts in New York, this was a routine restructuring of a distressed asset. To the families of the Lehigh Valley, it was a catastrophe. In the brutal arithmetic of bankruptcy court, promises are not currency. The obligations to the retirees, the men and women who had given their bodies to the mill, were classified as unsecured debts. When the assets were sold off to the International Steel Group in 2003, the pension fund was terminated and turned over to the federal government, which paid out significantly reduced benefits. The healthcare coverage, however, simply vanished. Thousands of elderly retirees, many of whom suffered from chronic conditions caused by their work in the mill, respiratory issues, hearing loss, joint damage, received letters informing them that their medical insurance was canceled, effective immediately. The social contract was shredded. The company that had paid for their births would not pay for their deaths. The human cost of this default was visible in the pharmacies and doctors' offices of Bethlehem. Men who had been proud members of the middle class, who had owned boats and cabins, found themselves unable to afford insulin or heart medication. The anger in the community was visceral. It was directed not just at the global economy, but at the specific individuals who had steered the ship into the rocks. While the retirees were calculating which pills they could skip, the executives who had overseen the collapse were protected by golden parachutes. The leadership team that had failed to modernize, that had built the extravagant Martin Tower, and that had filed the bankruptcy papers, walked away with severance packages worth millions of dollars. The injustice was absolute. The risk-takers of the Schwab era had been replaced by asset strippers who ensured their own safety while the ship went down. The physical plant itself began the slow process of decay. Without the heat of the furnaces to keep them dry, the structures began to rust at an accelerated rate. Weeds grew through the cracks in the concrete of the casting floors. The miles of rail track, once the busiest private network in the world, turned brown and brittle. The complex became a ghost town of industrial archaeology, a vast, silent reminder of what had been lost. Families who had worked in the mill for generations found themselves adrift. The fathers could no longer promise their sons a job at the steel. The continuity was broken. The younger generation left the valley in search of work, or stayed and found employment in the low-wage service sector that was slowly replacing the industrial economy. The definition of work in Bethlehem shifted from making things to serving people. The psychological impact on the city was profound. For a century, the identity of every resident had been tied to the production of steel. Whether you worked in the mill or not, you were part of the Steel City. Now, that anchor was gone. The skyline was still dominated by the blast furnaces, but they were no longer monuments to power. They were tombstones. They stood silent and cold, looming over a city that was trying to figure out how to exist without its heart. In the end, the company did not just fail as a business. It failed as a moral institution. It had convinced a workforce to believe in a mutual destiny, and then, when the ledger turned red, it sacrificed that workforce to salvage what remained of the capital. The fires were dead, the money was gone, and the people who built the company were left holding the empty bag. For nearly a decade after the bankruptcy, the 4-mile stretch of the Bethlehem Steel plant sat as a vast, decomposing carcass along the river. It was a brown field of unparalleled scale, a landscape of rusting iron, shattered glass, and soil contaminated by a century of heavy metals. The city debated its fate. Some called for the total demolition of the blast furnaces, viewing them as an ugly reminder of failure and economic abandonment. Others argued for their preservation as a monument to American labor. In the end, the site was saved not by a museum, but by a casino. In 2009, the Las Vegas Sands Corporation opened a massive gambling and entertainment complex on the footprint of the old ore yards. The development, later acquired by Wind Creek Hospitality, was an architectural deliberate choice. They did not tear down the blast furnaces. Instead, they sanitized them, stabilized them, and integrated them into the design. The towering stacks which once terrified the valley with their heat and noise became a dramatic, lit backdrop for the parking lot. The transformation of the physical space marked the final transition of the American economy from production to consumption. The land that had once generated wealth through the forging of tangible assets was now dedicated to the circulation of disposable income. Walking through the doors of the casino offers a sensory experience that stands in violent contrast to the history of the ground beneath it. Inside, the air is conditioned to a constant, sterile cool, scrubbed of the smell of sulfur and river mud. The lighting is low and artificial, designed to suspend the passage of time. But the most profound shift is auditory. For 100 years, this space was defined by the roar of the blast, the shriek of the steam whistles, and the rhythmic thud of the heavy forge. It was a soundscape of danger and purpose. Today, that roar has been replaced by the digital cacophony of 3,000 slot machines. The sound is a constant overlapping chime of major chords, designed by psychologists to trigger a dopamine response in the brain. It is the sound of money moving, but not growing. The irony of the demographic shift is visible on the gaming floor. Many of the patrons sitting at the terminals are the elderly residents of the Lehigh Valley. Some are the very workers who were stripped of their health care in the bankruptcy of 2001. They sit in the shadow of the furnaces where they earn their livelihoods, feeding their remaining pension dollars into machines owned by a multinational entertainment conglomerate. The cycle of the company town has closed. The money that was once paid out by the plant is now slowly being reclaimed by the entity that replaced it. The casino brought jobs back to South Bethlehem, but the nature of the labor had fundamentally changed. The thousands of positions created were not for millwrights, welders, or metallurgists. They were for dealers, servers, cleaners, and security guards. The wages were market rate for the service industry, a fraction of the inflation-adjusted earnings of a steelworker in the 1950s. The blue-collar aristocrat who could afford a home and a boat on a single income had been replaced by the service worker cobbling together shifts to pay rent. The economic engine that had built the middle class had been swapped for an engine that serviced the consumer class. Outside the casino, the preservation of the industrial ruins created a strange new public space. The Hoover Mason trestle, the elevated rail line that once carried the ore cars to the furnace mouths, was converted into a pedestrian walkway. Where men once choked on coal dust and risked death to keep the feed lines open, tourists now jog in designer athletic gear. They stop to read bronze plaques explaining the history of the casting process, taking selfies against the backdrop of the rusted valves. The violence of the industrial age has been neutralized and packaged as aesthetic heritage. The factory is no longer a place of production. It is a texture. While the blast furnaces were preserved as a scenic backdrop, the other great symbol of the company's history met a more definitive end. Martin Tower, the 21-story monument to executive ego built in the suburbs, had stood vacant for years. It was listed on the National Register of Historic Places, a towering tombstone of the corporate era. But it had no tenant. It was too large, too expensive to maintain, and too laden with asbestos to renovate easily. It stood as a reminder of the detachment and arrogance that had doomed the company. On May 19, 2019, the final chapter of the corporate entity was written in explosives. Crowds gathered on the surrounding hills, much like they had gathered to watch the last cast 24 years earlier. But this time, the mood was not one of mourning, but of spectacle. At 7 a.m., a series of controlled detonations rippled through the structural columns of the skyscraper. It took exactly 16 seconds for the tallest building in the Lehigh Valley to collapse into a pile of dust and twisted rebar. The headquarters that was built to project eternal power, the ivory tower where the executives had ignored the rise of global competition, was erased from the skyline. The destruction of Martin Tower and the preservation of the blast furnaces offered a final, brutal clarity. The bureaucracy, the paperwork, and the executive hubris were ephemeral. They could be blown away in seconds. But the iron, the physical reality of what the workers had built, was obstinate. It remained. The lesson of Bethlehem Steel is not merely a story about the decline of American manufacturing or the harsh realities of global trade. It is a lesson about the nature of institutions. The company did not die because the world stopped needing steel. Global demand for steel exploded in the 21st century. Cities in China, India, and the Middle East consumed more metal in 2 decades than the U.S. did in a century. The market was there. Bethlehem Steel died because it forgot what it was. It ceased to be an innovator of technology and became a custodian of the status quo. It stopped being a company that made steel and became a company that managed assets. The leadership believed that their past success guaranteed their future survival. They mistook the momentum of history for the security of a business model. They believed that because they were the biggest, they were the best, even as the data screamed otherwise. Today, the stacks of the blast furnaces stand silent, illuminated at night by blue and purple floodlights from the casino. They look less like a factory and more like a cathedral from a lost civilization. They are a monument to a specific moment in human history when the Lehigh Valley forged the skeleton of the modern world. The fires are out. The smoke has cleared. The air in Bethlehem is cleaner than it has been since the mid-19th century. The river is recovering. But the silence that hangs over the trestles is a warning. It is a reminder that no giant is too large to fall, and that the world owes no institution a living. The moment a system values its own preservation over its adaptation, the rust begins to form. And once the rust takes hold, it is only a matter of time before the backbone snaps. The story of Bethlehem Steel is not just a tragedy of industry. It is a mirror for our own lives. It teaches us that success is often the most dangerous narcotic. When we are winning, when we are comfortable, we tend to stop listening. We build our own versions of Martin Tower, walls of ego and habit that shield us from the uncomfortable truths of a changing world. We convince ourselves that what worked yesterday will work tomorrow, and that the storm clouds on the horizon are just a passing shadow. But the world does not pause for our comfort. To survive, we must be willing to tear down our own outdated furnaces. We must have the courage to admit when our methods are broken, to learn from our competitors instead of dismissing them, and to value the people who build our lives more than the symbols of our status. Growth requires the humility to change before we are forced to. If you found value in this history, please like this video and share it with someone who appreciates the lessons of the past. Leave a comment below with your thoughts. Did leadership or complacency kill the giant? And if you want to see more stories about the rise and fall of the empires that built our world, make sure to subscribe. May we all have the wisdom to see the rust before it breaks the beam, the humility to listen when the world whispers that it is time to change, and the strength to rebuild when the fires go out. If you received this prayer, write Amen in the comments.